Now, if you're like me, you have to get the most out of your food plots. I mean, let's face it, there's landowners out there that have 20 acres of food plots, 25 acres, 15 acres. And although they still should want to, for the resources and amount of time and money that they're spending, get the most out of their food plots, when you have smaller parcels and smaller food plots, and I'll give you an example, right here is 40 acres. We have about 3.5 acres of plots. We have them hidden in switchgrass, but that's about all we have to work with. We need to get the most out of our food plots so that they last as long as possible, not only through the hunting season, but then a little bit of carryover even in January and February if we can. I found there's 5 ways that you can make sure you get the most food plot, the most bang for your buck, the longest lasting food plots possible throughout the hunting season. And these are some tactics that have worked for me for a long time. And I'll mention, before I mention those 5 important factors, you have to follow a soil test. You have to take care of weeds. You have to make sure your pH is addressed, either too high, too low. Most of the time it's too low. Get your lime on if it's too low. Make sure that you take care of those fertility, pH levels, weeds, and follow the soil test recommendations, whatever they tell you to put out. And that's that first step always in making sure you have great food plots no matter what you plant. Now, aside from that, taking care of the soil test concerns, then one of the aspects that works, and we can't exactly do it out here because we're looking for flat areas. So I'm looking for areas that that complement each other. Deer come to this food plot, they eventually make it down to that food plot. There's a long linear food plot over there. We're trying to create long linear food plots, or a series of round or oddly shaped food plots. We laid it, and we have to build the food plots to lay the land around here. There's too much slope, so we have to use the flat areas and benches. But we're using long linear food plots. We're using food plots that step down to other food plots off the terrace. And it might be a long food plot that's wrapping around 300 yards in length. It might be 80 to 90 feet wide, and you have undulation to it, outside corners. That allows deer to feed and have their own little spot, but at the same time, it moves more deer. The longer and linear your food plots, I find that deer move more. Dominant does move subordinate does. Dominant does move young bucks. Mature bucks move all the deer during the deer season, during the rut. And so you have this constantly changing and moving. Sure, they camp out for a little while, but a lot of times there's always another deer that's coming along to move. When I find that deer move along that food plot, and they're forced to move through long linear food plots to get to a certain destination location, that they feed less. They're not just camping out in one location and hitting it all the time on your property, and making sure that deer don't have that chance to just sit in one spot. They're going to consume your food sources a lot more. Now, aside from the shape of the plot, you have to make sure that there's no summer food sources. So when you have no summer food sources, you don't have that resident population of does and fawns camping out on your land and just annihilating those 2 or 3 acres of plots when your fall plots are available. And a lot of times those summer plots convert to fall plots, meaning that your summer plots of beans, your summer plots of peas, whatever it might, sunflowers, buckwheat, they also convert into fall plots. The deer there all summer long, and so you have that resident doe and fawn population in the form of a doe factory. They're just waiting there. As soon as your fall plots come up in the fall during hunting season, they're annihilating before they get to full volume, and it's all goes back to those summer plots, and those summer plots that are carrying deer all summer, only to be there during the fall, especially in the form of does and fawns. Now here, we try not to plant any summer plots at all. We're just maintaining these. We're taking care of the weeds, taking care of fertility levels. I don't want deer on these plots. I don't want to establish that pattern of use, because again, we're just shooting ourselves in the foot when it comes to creating volume. Now, when it comes to planting the type of food that would withstand grazing pressure, you need to be very careful when it comes to small food plots, even if they are 2-3 acres in size and small parcels. Beans, for example, are the #1 crop failure that I see on a given basis all season long, every year when I visit client properties. It's always the 3 to 5 acre, up to 10 acre bean story in a wilderness setting or a big wood setting, there's not much else green, and the deer just annihilate the beans. So that magic plot that they were hoping for in December is not there because they ate it down to the dirt before the season even begins. I've seen it time and time again. And I've seen the flip side where there's not a lot of deer there during the summertime for whatever reason. There's not a bad winter, and those soybeans end up rotting and laying in the field during the springtime because the deer did not have to leave their fall ranges. Brassicas, rapes, turnips, tillage radish, various forage types of rapes. There's a lot of, there's always a mix of 6 or 7 varieties that you can use. In a northern setting, wilderness setting, you have guys in southern Michigan, northern Indiana, hunters in Ohio that are planting this in northern Ohio, low cover areas, big ag areas, and for whatever reason, low deer numbers are not hitting the brassicas and that brassica family very hard. I've seen those rot in the spring too. That's less than 10% of all whitetail parcels, but it does happen. But you can put brassicas up north. I had 8 acres and low deer density in the UP of Michigan out in the middle of nowhere, and those deer would annihilate those brassicas. So by the time November rolled around, there was really not much brassica left. Over the years, I converted more to greens, grain of rye, wheat, oats, layered rye. So that I was trying to produce a volume of adequate food as opposed to a high volume of superfood that the deer liked so much they wouldn't allow it to get to hunting season. So really picking the volume of food that's correct for your area is really good too. For example, corn. A lot of times deer will leave corn alone during the summertime if there's not excessive deer numbers, and you can have a great November food source, but you really want to complement that with some greens that'll stick around too. Those greens could be brassicas, they could be layered rye and oats and peas too. So you really need to focus on that blend that's going to give you the most volume when it matters most in November. Now at the same time, this year alone, I've seen deer, I've talked to landowners where their corn is getting annihilated all summer long, even 2 to 3 acres, because there's nothing left green during the summertime. They have big wooded settings, and so the deer are just hammering that corn before it ever gets a chance. So really focusing on green combination that can work well for you, adding some corn if you have enough room and that can make it during the summertime, and then lastly those beans if you're looking for either that ultra early season, early September, or that winter time if your beans are left standing. But it does you no good to focus on the glamour crops of beans and peas and maybe even some corn if the deer are going to annihilate before the season even begins. So making sure you have that enough green is very important. Now you have to have the complete picture. Deer feeding 5 times in a 24-hour period. That means 2 times during their bedding areas, in their bedding hours. That would be early to mid-morning and early afternoon. And then once on your food plots in the afternoon. If you have adequate browse and adequate cuttings, hardwood regeneration, briars, woody shrub tips, acorns, chestnuts in your bedding areas, then the deer do not need to hit your food plots. And what I found is in the UP of Michigan where I was at, low volume habitat, a lot of conifer, tag alder, leatherleaf, really nothing that the deer could really browse on too much except for some small areas of small red maple pockets and a little bit of aspen here and there. And so then my food plots represented 5 feedings out of a 24-hour period. If you have enough adequate browse back in their bedding areas, woody shrub tips, hardwood regeneration from logging activities, hinge cutting, briars, weeds, whatever it might be, then they don't need to leave their bedding areas to expose themselves to come out into your food plots during the daylight hours. And so if you have hidden food plots, which you'd always have, you don't need to have hidden food plots that are requiring or attracting daylight use by the local deer herd because they have enough back in their bedding areas in the form of browse. That becomes their number 1 and 2 feedings of the day. And then their third feeding right before dark are your food plots. And then after that, you're hoping they leave your land, go to your neighbors like they do around here, feed on the ag land, feed on the bird feeders right down here. And then that way you start to, and you begin to have enough food and allow deer to lay off your food plots during the midday hours. And that's a 4th way that you can make sure you have enough volume and make sure your food plots last, is providing an adequate amount of daytime browse. Now finally, when you have that parcel that is a parcel where deer are holding during the daylight, deer in your bedding areas. The bedding areas are full of browse, and you're giving the opportunity for the deer to begin on your property and then leave your property at night, meaning they're still feeding for daytime number 1 and 2 back in their bedding areas on browse. The third feeding is on your food plots, and after that they leave your land. If the deer are inside your property, moving out to your plots, they're in that position where you're going to put them off your property at night. In the UP of Michigan, northern settings where there's baiting, that can mean they're hitting the bait piles all night. It's safe, social, they're active at night, they're visiting bait piles. Around here, they're visiting ag land, they're visiting parks in some areas, there's subdivision right behind us here. And so they're visiting those locations where we're taking pressure off the food plots because we're not the nighttime parcel. When you're a nighttime parcel, when you're a nocturnal parcel, I found that deer slam your food plots all night long. It's safe and social. They hit it, they readily consume your food plots, and your food plots represent too much of their 24-hour period of rhythmic pattern feeding, and your food plots cannot withstand that pressure. So if you're a nocturnal property, if you're over hunting your food plots, if you're hunting invasively, if your food plots aren't hidden, if you don't have those quality bedding areas, if you don't have browse and cover in your bedding areas, then you're going to come from off your land onto your land at night, and they're going to hit your food plots a lot longer for that and deplete your food plot resources, and you're not going to have enough food to last the entire season. So really focus on the volume this year in your food plots. Really ask yourself, am I creating and offering the most volume? Do I have browse? Am I making sure that my food plots match the lay of the land? They're hidden, they're linear, so you're not forcing deer into a big round circle and letting them feed all night. Do you have a nocturnal property, not a nocturnal property? Are your food plots taking care of weed control, pH levels, fertility levels? It all works together to make sure you have enough food to last the season. And even on a small parcel, 40 acres or less, with moderate deer numbers of 15, 20 deer hitting your food plots off and on throughout the season during a given evening, especially in October, November, you can actually have enough green food that lasts all the way past the season. And for that, you have the ability to not only be the herd influence of your hunt in the location, but you have the ability to be the herd influence and the quality of deer that you attract and build on your property, even if it's a small parcel. And that's how you do it, using food plots of high volume, going all the way through lasting all the way through the hunting season and beyond, and making sure that you actually can influence the daylight movement of the deer herd and build food plots that last the entire season.